everybody, to the latest webinar for Hired Power. You are tuning in today for our webinar, Suicide, Are You or a Loved One at Risk? We are here today with our very own Director of Client Services, Brandi Bradbury. Brandi is a licensed addictions counselor with over 25 years within the mental health and substance abuse treatment industry. Before joining us here in 2014, Brandi worked for three of the industry's leading behavioral health organizations in Loa, Utah. At Hired Power, she works closely with our executive team and personal recovery assistants, and she also serves as case manager on many of our cases. We also have an incredible guest speaker with us today, Shannon Decker. Shannon is the executive director and co-founder of the Speedy Foundation. She has nearly 20 years of private and public teaching and administrative experience. She is a mental health, first aid, QPR, and safe talk facilitator, and an educational and therapeutic consultant. She is part of the Office of Suicide Prevention for the state of Nevada, where she works on K-12 suicide prevention and serves as an advisor to the Mental Health Task Force for the USOPC, the Idaho Violent Death Reporting System, and her local chief of police. Today, our speakers will be educating us on the topic of suicide, as well as its causes and warning signs, and they'll help provide us with some tools to potentially help save a life. As you can tell, this is a very important conversation, and we are very excited to have two very wonderful and well-qualified speakers to guide us through today. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Shannon.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and grab the screen. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to see Brandi again. Brandi and I got to take a big, long road trip earlier this summer and really started doing a deep dive on some of the work that we've both done historically. And so thank you so much for having me to present. My organization is called the Speedy Foundation. I wear a lot of different hats. And so thank you, Emily, for sharing some of those. The Speedy Foundation is a very dear cause to my heart. The mission of the organization is to advocate to prevent suicide prevention, to promote conversations to end stigma, and support mental health education. My first career was education and school administration, and 10 years ago I lost my cousin. His nickname was Speedy, to suicide, and that rocked my world. That same year I had a second grader, a little girl. She was 8, and she told me, "My parents will be better off when I'm gone." And I didn't know anything about that. I didn't know what it felt like. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I knew that it was alarming. There was an alarm that went off in my system, and I knew something was wrong, but I went back to all of my professional development as an educator. I went to my child abuse reporting information. I was obtaining my master's in school administration. I went to my professors, my school administrator, the school counselor, and there was no solid information on what I was supposed to do, what I was supposed to say, and how to help this little girl. And so between personal loss and professional frustration, I set forth to understand suicide a little bit better. I'm going to show you a quick video that Speedy made going into the Vancouver Olympics to kind of show you the mentality that he lived with in order to excel in his discipline of sport, which was aerial skiing. So this is 30 seconds of Speedy.
I have an unfulfilled dream. I missed it just by a little bit. I tried everything I could, medal or not. I get to walk away never saying what if. Bones heal and bruises go away. It lasts forever. I have one chance to make it happen.
So that was a little promo that he made going into the Vancouver Olympics. He came home from those games. Those were his third games with a silver medal. His one piece of hardware at that worldwide level. And within a year and a half, he had died by suicide. Throughout his skiing career, 16 years on the US ski team, he shared a lot about struggles with mental health, with some adversities that he felt like he had overcome. And so when he passed, our family and friends decided that we would continue to share his story. We believe that he would have supported that. And so we will share his story throughout today with the belief that he would have given permission to do so. So whether we're talking about second graders or your cousin or an Olympian or a coworker or a client, these pieces are universal. We need to know what are the signs, what are the things that send out that alert and that alarm. We need to be able to find the words. We need to be able to talk about things directly, and then we need to be able to reach out. If you are joining this webinar as a clinician, that's amazing. You probably have a lot more tools in your toolbox. Not everyone has access to clinicians. It doesn't take a clinician in every single case where someone might be suicidal. We all have the ability to reach out, to have these conversations, and to connect people to care. So I personally am not a clinician, but I can help get someone connected who is struggling to that professional resource. Anyone can do that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what some of those resources are at a nationwide level. I want to start out with the 3 realms of ACEs. ACEs are relatively new to kind of mainstream understanding. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So this was a study that was done by Kaiser Permanente in the 90s. It had a survey of 10 questions that it asked. And from the results of those surveys, what they realized was that some of these adversities that happen in the household before an individual turns 18 can have a profound impact on the trajectory of someone's lifelong health. So things like parental mental illness, alcoholism and drug abuse, domestic violence, bullying, physical and emotional neglect. These are all things that happen. And we as a society don't talk about them very much. We've got a lot of prevention that's in place at this point in time. But this is really the first time that a study showed us that there is a correlation between the things that happen in childhood and our lifelong health. So if you're not familiar with ACEs, but this is of interest, I really recommend that you take a look. There are some incredible documentaries out there. The ACEs connection, where this infographic comes from, is actually now called the PACEs connection, because we're talking about positive experiences as well as these adversities. But beyond just those 10 adversities that we looked at in the household, there's additional adversities that happen within communities that can impact a person's health. Violence, poverty, lack of jobs, poor housing quality and affordability, historical trauma, structural racism, poor water or air quality, just to name a few. But these are pieces that were not involved in that study and we know contribute to adversities of life. These are creating trauma, and trauma we know lives inside the body. Another piece is environmental. Right now we've got a pretty substantial climate crisis that's happening, and natural disasters every time you turn on the news. We also have a global pandemic that's occurring, and between household, community, and environmental adversities, they don't all impact us the same way. But the more that we can be aware of them and how they might be impacting other people, the greater awareness and empathy we can have that somebody might be struggling with that. And this contributes to either protective factors. When we can acknowledge it, we can put prevention in place, or it can become a risk factor, possibly contributing to someone who might become suicidal. Deaths of despair. I think that deaths of despair is an incredible way to look at some of these really unsexy things like suicide, drug overdose, alcohol overdose. Looking at it through this lens that suicide is a means of death when someone is really feeling down from hope. There's 4 types of despair. There's cognitive despair, where someone is feeling defeated, guilty, hopeless, maybe pessimistic. There's emotional despair, where they have feelings of sadness, irritability, loneliness, and apathy. There's behavioral despair. This is when somebody becomes really risky, they're reckless, they're self-destructive. And there's biological despair. So that's that dysfunction of regulations within our body or hormonal instability. And so through the pandemic, we have seen that there has been an increase in these deaths of despair, a significant increase in the deaths of despair due to the opioid crisis. And I've seen Hired Power has done a lot of work. There's a lot of those recordings on your YouTube channel about that. And so I just want to acknowledge that there's a big overlap, there's a big intersection of where suicide and overdose deaths are there. And through our lens, we look at that as a death of despair. However, with suicide, we're looking at data that's a little bit outdated. This data comes from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And in nationwide, with suicide, we are 2 years behind. So we are looking at data that came pre-pandemic. Informally, some states do have more real-time data, but it takes about 2 years to suss everything out, to finalize it, to get it to the CDC, and to be able to evaluate it. And so the rates that we're looking at here are per 100,000. States like Idaho, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Montana, year after year after year, have the highest rates across the United States. There's a lot of reasons for that. We're going to talk about risk factors and protective factors. But you can see that all of these states are kind of going through those Rocky Mountains. They're rural states. They might have less access to mental health care, physical health care. They're rural in nature. There's a bootstrap mentality that if someone fails, it's their own personal moral failing. And they have a higher access to firearms. There's a different gun culture in these states than there are as we get into the Midwest, the Eastern Seaboard, and the Pacific Coast. So these are all just additional risk factors that somebody might have just based on their geography. But when we're looking at suicide data, we are losing over 47,000 Americans each year to suicide. It is the 10th leading cause of death. For individuals aged 10 to 34, it's the second leading cause of death. 10 years ago when Speedy passed, that statistic was actually the third leading cause of death. So we've seen an increase. In states like Utah and Nevada, suicide is the first leading cause of death for individuals 10 to 17. That's significant. It's an opportunity for us to put prevention in place for individuals of that population. We can also look at prevention with gender. We know that men die over 3 times more than women, and that women attempt suicide at a much higher rate. Nationwide, firearms account for 60% of suicides. And when we look at states like Utah, Idaho, Nevada, firearms are a higher rate than the nation. Veterans, again, have a higher rate of suicide, and 90% of people who die by suicide do have a mental health diagnosis at the time of their death. Sorry, they have a mental health condition at the time of their death, maybe not a diagnosis. We know that 43% do not receive mental health services within a year previous to their death. And that across the United States, we don't have the mental health providers needed to address the needs of our citizens. And I think that's the power that we have in organizations like Hired Power for families that are struggling to get their loved ones the help that they need. So looking at some of the signs, this list could go on forever. I want you to know that if you get that gut feeling, if there is a flag that goes up, if there is a smoke detector that goes off, if you're concerned about someone, take that as a sign. It might not be on this list. These are some of the common signs that somebody might be struggling with thoughts of suicide. And we know that pain isn't always obvious. We know that people try to cover up their pain so that they're not a burden to others. But anytime that we get this gut feeling, I want you to think of it as an invitation. A person is inviting you to acknowledge that something is going on here. It's an invitation to have an intervention, and that intervention could be as simple as a conversation. So if a person is talking about or wanting to die or is talking about suicide, that's a sign. If they're looking for ways to kill themselves, if they're feeling helpless, desperate, trapped, another common sign is giving away their possessions, prized possessions, putting affairs in order, having that reckless behavior, uncontrolled anger, an increase in drugs or alcohol use, withdrawal, anxiety and agitation, changes in sleep, highlight that one again, changes in sleep, sudden mood changes, or no sense of purpose. Whenever we're concerned that somebody might be experiencing this, let's take that as an invitation to start a conversation. There's a lot of risk factors. For an individual, having a previous suicide attempt is a huge risk that perhaps they could go on to die by suicide. A diagnosable mental illness or a physical illness, having social isolation, legal problems, financial problems, an impulsive or aggressive tendencies, losing a job, or if we're talking about youth and young adults, perhaps having a family member lose a job or experience financial hardships, and then a substance use disorder, that co-occurring comorbid condition. These can be incredible risk factors for somebody who might be contemplating suicide. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily suicidal. It means that we need to have our antenna tuned in a little bit further. It means that we can have a conversation about it and we can ask them about suicide if our smoke detector is going off. When it comes to relationships, having adverse childhood experiences such as child abuse and neglect, like the adverse childhood experience study, if we know that an individual has experienced those things, if they've taken the survey and we know what their ACE score is, that would be something to keep on our radar. Maybe somebody's experiencing bullying, or they have a family history of suicide. They've lost someone that they are close to or looked up to suicide. That's a risk factor. Relationship problems like breakups, violence, domestic violence, or the loss of the relationship, a loss of a loved one, a partner, or sexual violence. These can all be big indicators that somebody might be considering suicide. When it comes to communities, those barriers to health, like we see in many rural communities, cultural and religious beliefs, where suicide is somehow a noble resolution for a personal problem, or perhaps a cultural or religious beliefs where people are excluded, that it's not welcoming, and that differences in individuals are not cherished. And then suicide clusters in community. This is called contagion. Suicide is not contagious the way that COVID is contagious. Suicide is contagious in that it, when we lose someone that we treasured, or that we were close to, or that we identify with, it creates this idea in our head that perhaps it could be a possible solution for our unbearable pain or our unsolvable problems. One of the best things we can do when someone loses someone that they love or identify with to suicide is to talk about that. When we talk about suicide prevention, we like to use this analogy of a stream. And so the stream starts, at the tip of the mountain where, snow melt starts to create a little stream, and there's all kinds of incredible work that we can do. But as that stream grows stronger and stronger, a person might be struggling, and eventually they might get to a waterfall. And that's where we can put prevention efforts in place. We can have intervention efforts in place. And unfortunately, we might lose someone over those falls. If we do lose someone to suicide, that's called postvention. And some of the best work that we can do is to respond to someone who has experienced loss, whether it's a family member, a friend, children within school communities. They can have long-lasting impacts of that. And if we ignore it, if we don't talk about it, that creates additional clusters of suicide within communities. It might not happen right away. It might take time, it might take generations, like we see sometimes with Indigenous communities, where suicide contagion can span generations. But community risk factors are definitely having previous losses. Societally, stigma associated with mental health or help seeking. If we have a man up society, if we have a failure is your own personal moral failing, that can be a risk factor. Having easy access to lethal means like firearms or easy access to medication, that's a huge risk factor. And then having media portrayals of suicide that are unsafe. Shows like 13 Reasons Why have been studied, and it has shown that portrayal of suicide was detrimental to youth that consume that media. And so there are safe messaging protocols on how to talk about and how to convey suicide. These are the signs we should know, we should be aware of. And there's a lot more. You are welcome to take a gatekeeper training. We have some of those complimentary on our website. We've been able to offer those to individuals, and throughout different communities, they have gatekeeper trainings to really hone in on what are those signs. I'm going to show you a quick clip. This is from a film called The Weight of Gold. This came out on HBO during the pandemic. Michael Phelps was an executive producer and the narrator. Speedy's story is shared in this, and I'm going to show you a clip from Jeremy Bloom, who was an NFL player and a member of the U.S. ski team and an Olympian, just to kind of show you what I'm talking about when we're talking about knowing what the signs are.
I grew up with Speedy. Of course, he was on the aerial team. I was on the moguls team, and we were the young guys on the team. I looked at him like a carefree kid that had so much fun. He was always smiling. He was always happy.
And Speedy, how did you get that nickname? That nickname started when I was 11 years old. When I went to my first camp, I had a checkered life jacket and a big racing helmet that I borrowed from my uncle.
Oh, okay.
And didn't really grasp the concept of waiting in line in front of all the other campers and get 5 jumps in the time they got 2.
Okay, so it wasn't a girlfriend.
No. Luckily, it should probably be an ex-girlfriend.
It wasn't until 2009 when we were in Lake Placid at the Olympic Training Center for a World Cup. And he said, "Hey, can I chat with you for a second?" And I said, "Sure." And we went to the TV room. It was night. It was dark. There's no one around. And he said, "I want to open up to you for a second." And I said, "Sure. What's on your mind?" He started crying. And he said, "Most days I don't want to be alive." And I didn't know anything about mental health at that point. I was so off guard, because I think of Speedy as somebody who's always been so happy and so successful, and I didn't know how to react. And I just said, "Speedy, look at you. You're so incredibly successful. You're a good-looking kid. You have the wind behind your sails. Like, what's going on?" And he just really opened up to me, and I often think about that moment. I wish I could go back to it now, because I think I would have handled it a lot differently than I did.
So I share that clip because I talked with Jeremy after this interview, and I said, if this were to happen in 2019 as opposed to 2009, what would you do differently? And he said, I don't know what I was supposed to do. And his father is a pretty renowned psychiatrist over in Colorado, and yet he didn't know. The ski team didn't teach him, his background didn't teach him, his family didn't teach him, society didn't teach him, because we don't talk about it. As a society, we kind of just shut it down, and we don't talk about problems directly. We talk about things in circles. So different populations have different factors. When we're talking about this elite athlete population, we know that some of the things, those warning signs that we want to pay attention to are like decreased compliance to their health and fitness regimens, their restorative regimens, sleep, rehabilitation regimens, a noticeable shift in their self-care, their grooming, a pattern of being late or to practice or leaving early. And it's typically not a one-time occurrence, but a pattern across time. We know that suicide is usually not an impulsive act. It's usually an accumulation of pressure, fear, adverse life experiences where an athlete doesn't see another way out. I could put this up for any population. We can look at doctors. We can look at active military. We could look at veterans. We can look at mothers. We can look at women in Utah. We can look at children in Nevada. We can look at people in Boise, Idaho. We can look at different populations to see what are those risk factors. But at the end of the day, Jeremy needed to know those signs. He needed to know how to have that conversation and how to connect Speedy to care. It's not his fault. He didn't know. The same way, me as an educator, a classroom teacher talking to an 8-year-old, I didn't have the training. I had just lost a loved one to suicide. I had started a nonprofit, and I was working to get a suicide hotline call center set up in Idaho, but I didn't know any of this either. I had lost several friends to suicide previous to that. And I had so much guilt for so much I wanted to do differently, but I just didn't know. So I appreciate each of you being here. It looks like we've got 32 people on the line right now, which is amazing. Thank you for being here. I want to share a little bit more of Speedy's story, because suicide is rare. Suicidal thoughts, maybe even suicidal ideation and attempts are, they happen. It's more common. Suicide is rare. And that's huge. We want to keep it that way. The more that we can become the eyes and the ears of our, our communities, our families, the more we can help to reduce. But we also have to address trauma. And so when we look at Speedy, if he were to take that ACE survey, he would have scored a 6 or a 7. He had childhood sexual abuse. He had a sister who was killed by a drunk driver when he was 5. He had an uncle who became his caretaker by the age of 5 and 6, who died of AIDS during the AIDS epidemic. It's a lot of loss. That's a lot of grief for a child, plus additional adversities from that ACE screener. He had substance use and addiction issues. He had a lack of access to healthcare, navigating the U.S. ski team for 16 years. There was also a lot of stigma that was built into that organization. When it came to finances, he was an incredible gambler. He won $500,000 in Las Vegas. He invested in Park City's real estate economy, and it went bankrupt by 2009. He had a lot of head trauma in aerial skiing. He witnessed a roommate die by suicide and took on all the grief without ever being able to release the trauma from experiencing that suicide. He was misdiagnosed and had untreated mental illness with a family history of bipolar disorder. And the event that happened right before his suicide was getting a DUI. Before the news hit the media, he ended his life to shield himself from public humiliation. And so that's a lot. That's a lot for one human to endure. And in a suicide note that he left, he said, I think that I was put on this earth to see how much pain one person can endure. It's a lot of isolation. That is a lot of feeling like a burden. And when we look at Dr. Thomas Joyner's interpersonal theory on suicidality, he describes that a person has the desire for suicide when they have thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness. These are things that we can see in any death of despair, really. A person feels alone and they feel like a burden. And a person could live there their entire life. It's not until we have the built capacity for suicide when we're no longer afraid to die. And there's a lot of ways that we can build up the capacity. One of those pieces being losing someone that you know or love to suicide. It's at that point where all these circles intersect and we might have a near lethal attempt or we might have a completed suicide. And so for me, when I came across Dr. Joyner's theory, this kind of made it all click. For me personally, I've never had the desire for suicide. I've thought about my own mortality, but I've never had unsolvable problems or unimaginable pain. But now that I see it on paper, I can understand it and I can empathize with it a little bit better. I'm going to show you guys just a couple quick campaigns. We won't have time to go into depth with these, but it's time to have a conversation. We've seen the warning signs. How do we have this conversation? If I'm working with young adolescents or youth, this is a great campaign called Seize the Awkward that kind of goes through how do we have these incredibly awkward conversations? They have to happen. Historically, we just haven't talked about it. We talk in circles. But this is a great campaign from the Ad Council and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the JED Foundation on how to have that. Another campaign that I love is called Are You Okay? This comes out of Australia and it's teaching people to have the basics. Let's ask, are you okay? If we're concerned about suicide, let's talk about suicide. Are you having thoughts of suicide? And then let's listen. And let's get comfortable with silence. And then let's encourage action because we can't force anyone to do anything. We need to encourage them. We need to walk by their side. We need to help them make appointments. We need to call resources and put it on speakerphone and be there for that conversation. And it's not a one or done. We need to check back in. We need to circle back. We need to make sure that we are following up. So these crucial conversations are vital. When we know the signs, we need to be able to find the words. If we're concerned about suicide, we need to ask directly. We can say things like, I've noticed that you're not sleeping very much. I've noticed that you've become really aggressive. I've noticed that that you're sleeping all the time. I've noticed that you're showing up late to work, or that we're not talking as much as we used to. I'm concerned about you. Are you thinking about suicide? And when we do that, this lets that person know that you're willing to talk about suicide, this thing that we just don't talk about. You're willing to talk about it. You're willing to risk talking about the same thing. We're not talking about different things. And we know that talking about suicide does not put that idea in someone's head. Either they're thinking about it as a solution to their problem, or they're not. We are going to watch this video. This is one of my favorites. This is the great Breni Brown on empathy. If we could all be able to find the words and to do listening the way that Brene describes it, we would have a very different world.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. My marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So if we're thinking about finding the words, sometimes there aren't words. Sometimes it's just being there and sitting in silence. So let's reach out. You do not have to be the one to solve the unsolvable problem. You do not have to be the one to help with the unbearable pain. There are other resources. If you have your phone with you right now, please make sure some of these numbers are programmed into your phone. I'm going to explain them a little bit as you program. 741-741 is the crisis text line. That is nationwide. It's free. It's 24/7. It's confidential. It's all about texting. 1-800-273-TALK, which is 8255. That is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. When you call that number, it's going to say, if you are a veteran, please press 1. And if you press 1, that phone will roll over to the Veterans Crisis Line. If you are a veteran and you don't want to press 1, you don't have to. If you are in need of Spanish, that phone number is 1-888-628-9454. Or if you are deaf or hearing impaired, you might want the TTY number, which is 1-800-799-4889. This hotline is nationwide. It is 24/7 available. Different states have different call centers. Right now I'm sitting in Utah. The Utah call center is at the University of Utah. When Speedy died, Idaho was one of only 2 states that did not have a call center located within the state. And in 2012, we were able to get that launched. We scaled it up to 24/7. It's grown, it's become supported by the state legislature, and that's powerful. The last state that needed one was Wyoming, and theirs went live in 2020. And I believe it's now scaled to 24/7. If a person is calling and the local call center, which is staffed by incredible volunteers who have great extensive knowledge in suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention, as well as more trauma-informed practices, if they're not available, it will roll over to another local call center. There's additional resources that are out there that are different community by community based on people's readiness and community support. Most communities are starting to stand up mobile crisis units, which is a collaboration between local public health departments, behavioral health departments, and law enforcement. There are crisis centers that are beginning to be stood up where an individual does not need to go to jail to have their mental health or their substance use treated, and they don't need to go to the emergency room. Sometimes there's a middle ground where cost savings has been proven that if local governments or state governments can put these resources in place, crisis centers can help an individual and save communities the funding that it takes to respond with jail and with emergency departments. CIT trained officers are a crisis intervention training, which is also known as the Memphis model. This is a 40-hour training that many departments are putting in place. And there's lots and lots of other resources. But if you are getting an invitation, if a smoke detector is going off, we can reach out to these resources. You don't have to be suicidal to call the hotline. You don't have to be suicidal to text. You could be concerned about someone and not sure what to do. I'm concerned about my coworker and I can't go to HR and I don't know their family and I'm not sure how it's going to be received. Let me call the hotline. Let me tell them what's going on and I'm going to let them help me come up with a plan. Or perhaps you're having a conversation that you've had 6 different times with your mother-in-law, and eventually she discloses that, yes, she is thinking about suicide. She's been dealing with breast cancer and she feels like it's a terminal diagnosis. She just doesn't know what else to do. If you don't have the words, you can call the hotline. You can put it on speakerphone and let them talk to both of you as you come up with a plan. They should also be able to help you connect to those local resources. Does your community have mobile crisis? Do you have a crisis center? Is your law enforcement trained in any type of trauma-informed practices? They should also, the other piece that I want to add here is at this time, the National Lifeline is connected to your area code. So right now I'm sitting in Park City, Utah, but I have a 208 area code. So if I called that number, it's going to roll me up to the Idaho Crisis Center. So that's just something to be aware of if you're using this as a resource. You might not be connected to the local one just based off of your area code. There are huge protective factors for suicide. Having coping and problem-solving skills is huge. Having those cultural and religious beliefs that discourage suicide and are inclusive is huge. Having connections to friends, family, community supports, having those supportive relationships with the care providers, having that medical network, the availability of physical and mental health care, limited access to lethal means among people at risk. And if we're talking about the Western states, that means having some uncomfortable conversations about guns, limiting access to those. Utah has an incredible campaign called Lock, Limit, Remove. Just lock it up, limit access when things are tough, and remove them from the home until things improve. The #1 protective factor for anyone across the lifespan is feeling close to at least one trusted person. So I want you to think in your head right now, who is that person? I went in the wrong direction. I apologize. There we go. Okay. If we're talking about transitions are huge in life. That transition from childhood and teenage years into being an adult, is sometimes when we really start to struggle. And if you are thinking about a young person in your life, I would suggest looking at this resource called Starting the Conversation. It is a NAMI college guide. And while it says college guide, I look at it as a transition from age 17 to age 18. Thinking about the conversations we need to have if our loved one, if our child, if our students are moving on, what are the things that we need to take into consideration? It might not be a mental health concern for them, but they are going to have friends. They're going to start meeting people where they're having these emerging mental health conditions. This is the age when we start to see the onset of mental illness really become prevalent. And if we're going to talk about early intervention, we need to start thinking about FERPA and HIPAA and how things change when a person all of a sudden becomes an adult and parents don't have access to their medical records. For somebody who's struggling with thoughts of suicide, safety planning is huge. I'm seeing that my little image is blurry, but it's a simple evidence-based practice of creating a safety plan. The thing that, what are the warning signs for a person that we know that they're starting to struggle? What are some of their internal coping strategies? Who are the people in the social settings that provide distractions? Who are the people I can ask for help, and what are their phone numbers? Who are the professionals and the agencies I contact during a crisis? How can I make my environment safe? And the most important thing at the bottom of that page is, what is the one thing that is important for me and worth living for? What anchors me to life? What is my reason for living? Sometimes for a suicidal person, if we go back to that Venn diagram, they're isolated, they're a burden perceived. They might not have that connection to life. And so being a listening ear and being that connection, reaching out, could be helping them identify what is that reason for living. This is a safety plan that anyone who has made a suicide attempt and goes to the emergency room should be coming home with. So if you have someone who's struggling, please make sure that you talk about it. You can ask them about their safety plan. There are apps for people that can create these on their phone and then email them out or text them over. There are smart apps where you can program the people's phone numbers in so that if you're struggling, you open your safety plan app and just hit a button. This is something that Jarrett Speedy had multiple suicide attempts, and he never was released from the hospital with a safety plan. So this is just something that we definitely need to have more awareness of. For individuals who are experiencing thoughts of suicide, maybe they live with chronic suicidal ideation, maybe they've made a suicide attempt, CAMS care is a treatment. States like Nevada and Utah have been able to provide it through the Department of Health and Human Services. Speedy Foundation has provided this training up in Idaho. It's an evidence-based program where they're treating the suicidal ideation. You have to be able to treat the thoughts of suicide in order to get to the underlying causes of what drives that person to get there. And so many clinicians are afraid. They have been taught through their training and certification programs that suicidal clients are a liability. And for so many of us, there's a shortage of clinicians. It's hard to get in. There's long wait times. Sometimes we don't connect. And for a suicidal individual to disclose right away that they are suicidal can be really sometimes frightening for those clinicians. And so I encourage anyone who wears that professional hat to become trained in CAMS care so that you can help support those individuals struggling with thoughts of suicide. And Find Your Anchor is a grassroots, amazing program. I think we've got enough time. I'm going to show the video on Find Your Anchor.
Maybe you've read about this. Maybe you didn't have to read about it because it's already hit too close to home. But you should know the world is suffering from an epidemic of suicide. In the United States alone, the number of people taking their own lives has increased 25% since 1999. Globally, this epidemic costs us almost 800,000 of our mothers, brothers, spouses, children, heroes, and fellow humans every year. And each one of those people had their own story. But there's a consistent theme I've heard over and over. a feeling of being alone and unseen in the middle of an increasingly distracted and disconnected society. Stories about standing in a park or on a bridge, just waiting for someone to say hello, for just one smile from a stranger to prove to themselves that their existence matters. When you're suffering, it can really be something that small. Acknowledge me, smile at me, and I won't kill myself. What they need is something to grab onto, something to hold themselves in place. That's why I created Find Your Anchor. It's not a program or a hotline. It's something real you can hold in your hand. And inside are items designed to give hope, validation, and maybe a smile to the person who finds it. A letter, a poster, a deck of cards full of ideas and experiences that help anchor us to our lives. We launch these boxes into the world one at a time. People in need find them and take them home. They keep them as long as they like. When they're ready, they add something of their own to the box and launch it for someone else to find. So far, we've launched thousands of boxes in every state and over 35 countries. We've established partnerships with other groups dedicated to suicide prevention, and we've created custom blue boxes for partners in the military and education. We want a box on every college campus, on the desk of every congressperson, and in the hands of every veteran who suffers from suicidal thoughts. And you can help. A $25 donation covers the...
I'll stop it right there, just in the interest of time. An amazing resource. If you know someone who's struggling, send them a Find Your Anchor box. The Lady Gaga's Born This Way Foundation has been a big sponsor, and they've done a lot of work throughout the pandemic to get that awareness out the door. Another piece is just practicing self-care. If you have a loved one, if you have someone that you take care of that has been struggling with thoughts of suicide, we have to fill our bucket before we can help others. We have to make sure that we, use that airline metaphor, put your own oxygen mask on first before assisting others. And so these are the different domains of your health and wellness. And so I encourage you to develop your own self-care action plan so that you can maintain your own mental health and wellness and be able to be there for others. So as we wrap things up, I just want to make sure that you know that you need to take care of yourself. So if anything came up for you during this presentation, please talk to someone. You can reach out to us, you can call the hotline, you can reach out to someone that you trust. One of the best protective factors that we have is one trusted person, one adult in the life of a young person, one person that you trust in your life. And so I hope if when I asked you to reflect, if you didn't come up with anyone, we really need to focus on making sure that you have that trusted person in your life. And if you do have that trusted person in your life, maybe you can be that trusted person for someone else. I encourage you to further your education, take a QPR gatekeeper training, take our opioid response module. We know that those deaths of despair have spiked, and we can also see anecdotally, if not on paper yet, that suicide has also had a drastic increase throughout the pandemic. And so my little graphic doesn't seem to be working. There it goes. We need to tip the scale. We need to make sure that we are front loading. We are making it incredibly heavy on protective factors, connection, parent closeness, familial closeness, achievement, whether it's academic or work, overall resilience, healthy, happy neighborhoods, close, caring friends. This can help us overcome some of the trauma that we just don't have access, or we don't have the ability to prevent. That's something that we can all go forth and do. And so I encourage you to, you're welcome to get involved, reach out to me. I am on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. We've got YouTube videos. I would love your feedback. If you have time, you're welcome to grab that QR code and fill out an evaluation. But with that, I am open to questions. So Brandi and Emily, I turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, that was really awesome. Thank you for sharing all that really helpful information. I didn't know, Brandi, did you want to add anything in from the Hired Power perspective?
I wanted to, first of all, just thank Shannon for being here. when we were on our drive in the middle of nowhere, just having conversations and really getting to know her and hearing her passion around this message. I knew that I wanted to have her here on a Hired Power Knowledge is Key webinar. For me, I had a couple of things that I wanted to kind of talk about. And first of all, working with the state of Utah some years ago, what I learned is when I would take intoxicated or have intoxicated individuals taken to a hospital, we had the clinical care teams would refuse to do a suicide risk assessment because they were intoxicated. And I had two scenarios. The first one, they sent the person home and she had an attempt, and it was a lethal attempt that did not go lethal, but changed her life forever. The second time, the doctor was trying to release a different person. And I got on the phone and I said, if you are willing to sign your name on a discharge report that says that you feel confident this person will not complete a suicide, and I gave him, I was QPR certified, then I will, I'll support that decision. And he kept that individual overnight. And the next morning, they came in and did the suicide risk assessment and were able to get him to a hospital. And so for me, as an individual and a professional that's had people go to the hospital because of the risk and has hit a wall, I want to encourage people that are on this call, be it, you're a citizen that has that gut feeling, or you're a professional trying to get someone help, push the envelope. Don't just take the sorry, they don't qualify release. We have to be the ones that help push that to save the individual. I believe that person's alive because they stayed that night. And so just, Shannon, do you have any suggestions for us, given, you have that gut feeling, you ask that question, what is the next step, or should we push the envelope? Should we push back on that doctor? What is your experience with that, or your training with that?
My experience is that suicide is complex and that each situation is different, and that it sounds like in that situation, you did some incredible advocacy and that it was well received. For some individuals, a hospitalization can be detrimental to their mental health. And so that is the power I see in states that are standing up those crisis units, where mobile crisis can come in and do an evaluation, or a crisis center can help de-escalate a situation where a person can get clean and sober, they can take a shower, they can sleep, they can meet with a social worker who can do an evaluation. And so because we're talking about such a wide spectrum, I think that we just need to find the best resources that we have available in the community. We need to make sure that we aren't hearing that somebody is having thoughts of suicide and think they need to be hospitalized immediately, that each situation is different. And the more that we can increase our skills, practice those skills, and go with our gut feeling, that if we need to advocate for a doctor to really take a closer look, that's incredible. And at the same time, sometimes we hospitalize individuals that are having thoughts of suicide, and what they really need is they need a clinician who understands suicide and not somebody who's just trying to push them through. And so I think that's the power of CAMS care.
Absolutely. Awesome. Also, I had something come up, recently to me in a local high school, that it's a very common communication that they're using, that is just, they text GKYS or JKYS, which is go kill yourself or just kill yourself. This has come off of a TikTok. And do you think that there is concern for repetitive languaging like that? Do you think that increases concern, or should we as parents or community be like reacting to that messaging?
Yeah, that type of messaging is incredibly, disturbing. It's distressing to hear about, and it's absolutely something that needs to be taken seriously. That is the type of stuff where an individual could continue to say it, they can continue to share it with others without really understanding the full impact of what killing yourself is. There's an incredible program that was developed in Provo, Utah called Hope Squad. And the creator of Hope Squad has worked a lot with researchers, but what they talk about are responding to some of these suicide attempts. Young teenagers who are living through their attempts, and when they come back, it wasn't reasonable. It was with youth suicide, there is a lot of impulsivity, but it's, like I had a breakup, or somebody told me to kill myself, and I felt like I had no other option, and they make an attempt. When they come to in the hospital room, they're grateful to be alive, but it's, in reasoning with them, it was like, well, my ex-boyfriend would have been upset, and then we could have gotten back together on Monday. And it's like, you've missed the whole point. Death is final. And if you are telling someone to kill themselves, or if you are attempting to take your own life, that is a final decision. And I think that's what the concern is with films like, or the series 13 Reasons Why, where an individual kills themselves and then they're looking back on their life as if they're getting revenge on all these other people. And that's not the reality. And for the developing mind, we know that the frontal lobe isn't done developing until, age 24, sometimes age 27, that we need to protect people. And so greater awareness for parents so that they can intervene, for educators, that type of texting absolutely plants that idea into people's minds and can be detrimental to their health.
Awesome. Okay, well, we are running a little low on time, so I want to give some time for a couple audience questions before we have to be done. So first question, I had a transport adolescent female suicide attempt, but she was sent to a substance use disorder treatment facility. Where are there places where she could go that will address her mental health, as she was not an addict or alcoholic?
That is a great question. It's sometimes very hard to come by. And so it's possible that she was transported there because that was one place that was willing to take a suicidal individual. In the small amount of consulting that I've done, it is hard to find programs that are willing to take suicidal individuals. I've also seen that there's not a lot of really sophisticated suicide intervention that is in place. There's a great opportunity for those in wilderness programs and in residential programs to scale that training. Again, I think CAMS Care is probably the best that's out there at this time, and so that they feel more comfortable to taking suicidal clients. I've not found a perfect place that I would say, this is where we take suicidal clients. I'm not sure if Brandi has any other ideas.
No, I just echo what you're saying, Shannon. Everyone, that risk is, it's a risk that everyone, I think, in a residential or contained program kind of has to really measure it out, and it is very difficult. And I'm with you, if it's a public school or a private school or a wilderness program or a community health center, I hope that, as we only have the data from 2019, and I know personally how many of my children's friends have completed a suicide lately. And I think that when we get the 2021 numbers, when we're in 2023, we're going to be validated in knowing how much we're feeling right now. And that we have to start educating ourselves, becoming more familiar with that uncomfortable conversation, and figuring out how, as a citizen or a professional, that we can impact and do something to help these individuals. And I love what you said, Shannon. It's the gut feeling, it's that gut feeling.
Awesome. Okay, so another question. Somebody asked, do retired seniors have specific resources available to them?
Depends on the community. I think that, perhaps they'll have resources from their retirement plans. Sometimes communities have resources for retired seniors. Years ago, there was a state that was doing psychological autopsies on samples of suicides from the community, and they selected a lot of elderly suicides. What they recognized was that there were a lot of elderly individuals who were handing over, relinquishing their comfort animals, their pets, to the local humane societies. And so they realized that they had a prevention opportunity. They could go in and offer gatekeeper trainings to the volunteers in these humane societies to say, if an elderly person comes in here to surrender their animal and they are seemingly, healthy, the animal's seemingly healthy, let's have these conversations. Let's, acknowledge that perhaps they're suicidal, and let's ask the question, get them connected to care. And if you're not willing or able, then let's call for a welfare check on this individual. And so I think that it's community by community. Elder suicide is not a sexy topic. So there's not some front running, well-funded nonprofit that I'm aware of. Jeremy Bloom, who was in that clip from The Weight of Gold, actually has a pretty remarkable nonprofit that he created in memory of his grandparents. But it's not suicide related. But I was just kind of thinking they're far and few between. So if you find any, please feel free to send them my way. I'll continue to share that. But I think that it goes to your local resources.
Great. Okay, so we're going a little over time, but I just want to answer just a couple more, and then we'll sign off. So next question, it's from the same person as the first one. She says, a dear friend of mine lost her son to suicide. He was on his way to the Olympics for wrestling. It happened about 2.5 years ago, but the mom is still, struggling with that. And just wondering, any kind of advice or referrals or anything that you can offer for that type of a situation.
2 years out is hard. I think that 2 to 4 year mark is really, really hard. Suicide is complex, and that grief is incredibly complicated. We have survivor of loss boxes with all of these resources, those tangible resources, kind of like a find your anchor box that we put in and we can send out with letters and poems and a journal and those things that are just specific to suicide loss. There are suicide support groups. One of the best places to go is the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention to find local support groups or to get on a virtual support group, to be able to talk about it, to be able to share. They also have a service called Caring Connections, where you can ask for a trained volunteer who's experienced loss. They're kind of in that place of recovery. They've been through a training. And, if you're a father who's wanting to connect with another father who's experienced loss, that's huge. There's also a lot of suicide prevention nonprofit organizations like the Speedy Foundation that have been created in someone's memory. And so getting involved in those in your local community, or the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention chapters, is another great place to feel like you're with your people who've experienced that same type of profound loss.
We just had another question come in while you were answering that one. Somebody kind of in a similar situation. She says it's been 10 years for her, and she's wondering how long that grief usually lasts.
It changes you. I don't know if you'll ever be the same. I don't know if I'll ever be the same. Sorry. It changes you.
Okay, well, thank you to both of our speakers. This was a really wonderful conversation with lots of helpful information, and thank you to everybody that tuned in as well. We're very thankful to have you here with us today, and I hope that you got some useful information out of this conversation. We hope you enjoyed. We'll be sending the recording out in just a couple of days, and if there's any way that we can help you or or a loved one, even if you just want to talk or explore other options, Higher Power is always here for you. You can visit our website or give us a call. We have 24/7 assistance. So yeah, thank you and have a great. Oh
yeah, and Emily, before we hop off, I do want to leave one more resource. It's not quite online yet, but in July of 2022, so this coming summer, we will have a nationwide 3-digit number. I see that there's another question in there on 988. So 988 will replace that 1-800-273-TALK. 988, we will help to destigmatize accessing mental health care. We have 911 for physical health emergencies and safety emergencies. We're going to have 988 for mental and behavioral health crises. This is going to also help to scale those crisis centers, mobile crisis. Right now, societally, we've got a defund the police, social rally cry, which is very controversial. But at the same time, we have police force that does not want to be responding to suicidal ideation. We've got problems with suicide by cop. And so 988 is going to really help us. It's going to become, it's going to be free, 24/7, anonymous, confidential. It will be something that we can text, so we don't have those two separate numbers. And it's just really going to scale the type of the help that we need. So that's something that's exciting on the horizon. And we're not using it yet, but 6 months from now, we'll be there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Shannon. And thank you so much for all the useful information from this talk today. We're just getting so many thank yous in the comments right now, and just great to see. All right. Well, everybody, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thank you for tuning in.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.